Hello, hello, McFleet. We are back at McFly's Movie House with me, Marta McFly, and we are heading back to France for today's episode. We have covered Eric Rohmer's Six Moral Tales. We also covered Jacques Demy's unofficial romance trilogy, and now we're going to visit one of my favorite films of the French New Wave movement, Agnès Varda's Cléo from 5 to 7 from 1962. And this film is incredible. I know I say that all the time, but this one really, really is. It's such a fabulous entry into the French New Wave movement itself, while offering a refreshing and feminist perspective for a group of filmmakers that were primarily men in this movement. So it's a film that may initially feel like it's exploring the fears associated with mortality, but ultimately it's just so much more. You get themes of isolation and loneliness, self-identity, public persona, and honestly just being a woman and dealing with the male gaze. So there is so much there. And to top it off, the film is also a wonderful cinematic journey that plays with time. And we're going to be covering that also. So today I'm bringing on another special guest. He is a fellow film journalist working as a senior film critic for Agents of Fandom. He's attended the New York Film Festival, South by Southwest, Sundance, and the Seattle Film Festival through his work, among others. He's also the host of two podcasts, which I've honestly guested on both now that I think about it, the Movie Draft podcast and 24 Minutes of A24. And he recently started a YouTube channel, Movies Are So Back. I don't know how he does it all, but it is my absolute pleasure to have Ethan Simmie on the podcast. Hey, buddy, how are you?
What's up, Marta? I don't know how I do it all either, quite honestly. So I don't know. We'll find out one day, maybe, when we solve all of life's problems. But I am so thrilled to be here on your pod. I have not been a guest on a pod in like a long time. And there's definitely a distinctual kind of like different energy when you come on as a guest versus hosting. So I'm just stoked to be here talking about movies.
Yay! Oh, I'm so excited too. And especially Cleo, like what a fantastic movie. I'm even wearing my Varda shirt today.
Wow. You're so cool.
Committed.
I am wearing my Tom Cruise Top Gun Maverick shirt. That's how I'm celebrating Cleo from 5 to 7. I don't think they're related, but that's where I'm at.
You never know. It's so funny to me. This is crazy. I feel like every few episodes somebody brings up Top Gun Maverick. I'm not even joking. I feel like you're the fourth person or fifth person or something. So
love to see it. I mean, as we should, honestly, like we should build a Tom Cruise statue, but we should probably first and foremost build an Agnès Varda statue is what I will say.
I would love that. And I was thinking about movies that are so very dear to us for today's episode. And I remember I sent you a list and you immediately chose this film. So what's your connection to the movie and why do you love it so much?
I think the first time that I watched this film, as I kind of pull it up here on my letterbox to see my past with this movie. So I've seen it twice. One was the first time, obviously, and then once for this show. And when I first watched it, I think I watched it way back in May of last year. And that was really when I personally was like starting my like, let's not just watch the MCU kind of phase of my life, where I was like, there's other movies out there, kind of a thing, because I really kind of came into film late in 2021. So like, I still feel like an infant compared to you and several others that are out here that are like, I've been watching good movies for a decade. I've been watching good movies for like 18 months. So I remember this being suggested to me as like, you have to watch this. This is like, if you're getting into film, this is one of those movies that you should check out. Obviously at the time for me, I was like, it's French and it's in black and white. That's got to be good. I had no idea who Agnès Varda was. I had no clue like what this represented in terms of the French New Wave. I really had no connection to it other than the very superficial connection that I think is hilariously ironic to bring up today of all days that we are recording. And I know this will date the pod, unfortunately, but
it's okay.
The Criterion 50% off sale is starting at Barnes and Noble today. And I remember I was like, yo, this movie's on Criterion. That's legit. Like we're talking cinema here. So I watched it and I was like, whoa. Like movies, this is crazy. Like I think this is phenomenal what I just watched, and like it took me a long time to process it, and instantly became this and like the Young Girls of Rochefort and Belle de Jour. Like these are that to me is like the holy trinity of like I love film now and I get movies, and so anytime somebody asks for one of those, you know, like, what can I watch that's not, you know, the bike riders this weekend? I'm like, oh, check out these French films. That'll really put you in good presence with people. So that's kind of like my personal connection. I still don't have like a huge personal connection to Agnès Varda, actually. Like, I've seen Cléo from 5 to 7, and then I saw the film that you suggested to me recently, La Bonheur, I think it's called, or Happiness, which was sensational, truly sensational. So I'm thrilled to like discuss a movie that I literally have never externally discussed. I've only like lived with it with myself.
I'm so excited, and I love that you watched Le Bonheur as well, because it's so different to this. Like, I refer to it as a candy colored nightmare to anyone who listens, because it looks like, if you look at stills of it, you'd be like, oh, this looks so cheery and happy and tra la la, and then you watch the film and you get to the end and you're like, whoa, what just happened?
Yeah, that film, I was really locked in, and unfortunately, I know this will not play well with the story that I just told, but I watched it on my phone on a plane, which is like terrible. And I'm like, you know, after speaking of like the greatness of Top Gun Maverick, of like, see it in IMAX. So I watched this movie on my phone on a plane, and I was so locked in, and like probably the last, I guess it would be like the last 12 minutes, like the last 10 minutes. If you've seen the film, you kind of know what I'm referring to, where I was like, oh man, this is like kind of really dark. And like, I don't know if, like, I don't know what happiness is, I guess. And like, I've never thought about that in those terms before. And it is so, like, it's such a juxtaposition, because it's a gorgeous film, just downright beautiful to watch, with a pretty like haunting minor key score that's like really plays a large part in the film. So yeah, super, super exciting stuff to actually discuss Agnès Varda. And yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to get into these films.
Well, besides watching Le Bonheur on a plane, which, you know what, I will give you the benefit of the doubt, you were on a plane, so I get it. But what else have you watched recently that you can recommend to me and listeners?
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. Coming on your pod, I feel like there's a certain amount of like, have you heard of this movie? You should watch it kind of vibe that I should try to encompass, and not like, hey, you should watch Singing in the Rain that I just watched for the 18th time the other day.
Hey, we're open to everything and anything.
You know, which by the way, most weekends, as of late, honestly, I've been trying to take the weekends with me and my kids and my wife, and to not do podcasts and not do content and not pursue this life of ours that we do. And generally on a Sunday morning, that will entail putting on Singing in the Rain. And so it's usually about a once a week watch with me and the girls. So obviously, I think that's a great suggestion. I'm just going through my Letterboxd diary here and trying to find certain things that I think are really worth calling out. Let's see real fast. I have a movie that I recently watched that I really, really, really like. Little movie called A Clockwork Orange. I'm not sure if you've heard of it.
It's familiar.
Might sound familiar. Not a lot of people have seen it, but I actually watched it for the very first time. And so someone like me, where I was like, had kind of built it up in my head of like, oh wow, it's a Stanley Kubrick. Like this is a big deal. It is a big deal, but it's also like, I guess my encouragement would be like, just flip it on, you know, like, I know it's a heavy movie, and I know like a lot of these films, something like this, even Cléo from 5 to 7, is like, it could be as heavy as you want it to be. It could also just be like, oh, we're just like walking through Paris. This is sick. And so I guess my recommendation is like, watch movies like that. And like, I know Challengers like just came out on VOD, and you know, Furiosa is coming out on VOD. So like, I know those are really popular movies, but like, you know, just toss them on. Like I have a really bad habit of being like, I gotta tee this up to be a great night, when I should just put on like I Saw the TV Glow at like 4:30 and just be like, yo, this is sick.
Yeah. No, I totally get what you mean. I have a bad habit personally of like really watching serious stuff for weeks on end, and then like I'm emerging from my hole, gasping for air, just being like, I just need a blockbuster or something to just like reset. So I agree with you. Yeah, watch something classic, and then maybe watch something modern and fun.
Yeah.
So
can I give one more suggestion? I know I'm really going on here, but I think this is much in your vein here on the show. Kino Lorber recently had a sale that I partook in for the very first time, and I was like, oh, this is exciting. Like, I'm just gonna blind buy a bunch of movies, and I'll watch them periodically and like go physical media, and I'll have what I have. One of the films I watched was called Sinner: The Secret Diary of a Nymphomaniac, and it's quite explicit and it's pretty intense, obviously, as the title suggests. But I loved this movie. It's by Jesus Franco, who I guess did a lot of similar storytelling in the early 70s. I believe it's a French film. Not a lot of people have seen it or logged it on Letterboxd. It's like pretty in the weeds, but it's basically about a girl who is trying to discover herself amid a world of exploitation and relationships and French clubs in the early 70s.
Oh.
It's a really great time if you're looking for something that's exceptionally out of the box. That would be my like really deep cut rec for now.
I like that. I just watch listed that. That sounds thematically, that kind of sounds like Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, if you've seen that or if you've heard of it, about a girl discovering herself. But I will check that out. Also, I had no idea about that sale. That really upsets me. Let me know next time, please, because I would absolutely get on top of that. But for today's discussion, let's move along. And I will just break it down for you, for everybody else. So what we're going to do, we're going to tackle some information about Varda and her background first, how she relates to the French New Wave movement. Then we'll get into describing what Cléo from 5 to 7 is about. Then I was thinking about how to tackle today's chat on the film itself. And I decided that since the film happens in real time, I think the best way to go about it is to touch on its themes in the order of the film, in chronological order, since that's kind of the best way we can truly see Cléo's own internal shift that happens from start to finish. But yeah, how does that sound?
Yeah, I love it. It sounds exciting.
Amazing. Okay, so let's get into it. So Agnès Varda, praised by many as the grandmother of the French New Wave movement. Very true. She was born on May 30th, 1928 in Belgium. Her father was Greek, her mother was French, and she sadly passed away from cancer on March 29th, 2019, at the age of 90 in Paris. And I know you weren't into her back then, but I remember when she passed away, I was devastated. I just love her films so much. I should also mention, since I brought up Jacques Demy at the start of the episode, and you did as well, actually, you brought up his movies. Yeah. So they were married. She met him in 1958 at a short film festival. He became her husband. They moved in together in, I believe it was 1959, got married in 1962, and they remained together until his death in 1990. They were so in love. She also did wonders to preserve his films and keep his legacy alive while she was alive. And that just kind of fills my heart with so much warmth. So, I mean, did you know, actually, first of all, that they were married?
No. So we were briefly talking before we started recording here that I had a very late lunch today. And with that very late lunch and empty stomach, I had a beer. And at that time, I was reading the French New Wave, like Wikipedia, just to like see what the wiki is saying and like catch up on anything I might have missed in my schooling. And so I was reading through it. And obviously talks about Agnès Varda like being a very prominent figure in this movement. And like in parentheses, it was like married to Jacques Demy. And I was like, I literally turned to my wife and I was like, Agnès Varda was married to Jacques Demy? This was like literally 36 minutes ago. And I was floored. And my wife, Molly, just bless her heart, lovely woman, has no idea what I was talking about. She was just like, "That I'm so happy for you. Like, I don't know what that means." And I was like, this is incredible news. And so I obviously told her like, this is what it means for cinema and for film and like the French New Wave. And she was like, wow, that's so exciting. And I was like, it really is so exciting. So I didn't know, but now I know. And like, I just like thinking about that fact of two truly historical and legendary filmmakers, but like people that think like they think, that is so new. And they tell ideas and themes and stories with their visions that Jacques Demy and Agnès Varda have. I cannot imagine being in a relationship like that, like in the best way. Like, yeah. Those are two people that are just clearly sorted for each other. They found their person. And I think like that is such a beautiful thing. And again, like really interesting to think about against the films that they have made. I think that is a really fascinating thing to like, I don't know, just ponder. Like, cool. You make art, but you also have this incredible relationship where in your art, you like directly dissect the poisons of like relationships. I think that is really interesting, but I think it's so cool that they were married.
Yeah, I love that you're geeking out on it, and like your reaction of finding that out was my reaction when I first found it out. I was
It's wild.
gasping for air. It's incredible, and their movies are so different, and that's what I mean. I just love that they championed one another so well. There's a great supplemental doc on the Criterion Collection, or channel, I should say. I think it's also on the special features of the movie for The Young Girls of Rushmore. It's the making of the film, and Varda directed that like behind the scenes doc. And she was on set when Demi was recording that movie, like filming her own doc about the film. And then she completed it finally 25 years later. So it's just, yeah, I just love that about them. Anyway, back to Varda.
So neat.
Yeah, isn't it? Where was I going with this? Oh, right. Her debut feature. Yes. So in 1955, she did La Pointe Courte, a really impressive film. If you you've only seen two by her, so you haven't seen this yet, have you? No.
I have not.
Okay, put that on your list. It's so ahead of its time. 1955. It also, you're gonna geek out over this too. It also contains some shots that are like strikingly similar to what Bergman would do with Persona years later.
Oh, interesting. That's
all
so
I'm gonna
fascinating.
Yeah.
I just want to like, I want to thank you for like bringing me on this pod to like talk about this theory, like not only this movie and Agnès Varda, but like the French New Wave. Like this is something as a film person I have never talked about with anybody. Like I've never like gone to a movie with a friend and be like, yeah, so like French New Wave in the 60s, like you want to grab a Miller High Life and like talk about it. Like I've never done that. So like this, it really is me geeking out of like, oh my God, they changed the fucking world. And it's kind of wild to like dissect it. Anyway.
I know. No, I love this. Well, you know what, Ethan, you can come back on whenever you want. So
wow.
We can chat about the French New Wave whenever you want. But so La Pointe Courte, yeah, so that movie. So that is also considered by many the first film of the French New Wave movement. As I said, it came out in 1955. And what's interesting and crazy is that Varda was 26 when she made that movie. She had no filmmaking education or experience, none. And I was reading an interview with her where she even admitted that she wasn't even a cinephile and she saw very few films before becoming a filmmaker. Like, isn't that just crazy?
That's so cool. That is so insane to be that naturally gifted.
Yeah. So, I mean, that said, she did read a lot. She loved dialogue, but her background came in photography. She first studied art history and photography. Then while she worked as a photographer, she actually intended to become a museum curator. And through her photography, that's how she started making money. She said she took, what did she call them? Trivial photographs of families and weddings. And then in 1951, her friend Jean Villard opened the National Theatre National Populaire. I think that's just the National Theatre. I don't know. And he hired her as the official photographer. Before that, she also did some work as a stage photographer for another theater. And so from 1951 to 1961, she kept photographing. And her reputation just grew that way. She became a photojournalist. And to me, that's a really fascinating start. And it makes so much sense that she was a photojournalist because she's also so well known for documentaries as well. So this begs the question, why did she go from photography to film? Especially if she wasn't a cinephile. It's just weird. It turns out that it was kind of by accident. Like she was once lent a camera to record some landscape shots in the south of France. And as she's recording this, she realized that film added the dimension of time to visuals. And she knew about the composition of photographs, but she wanted to play around with time more. And there's a quote from her that I wanted to share because I thought it was just fascinating. She said, "When I made my first film, La Pointe Courte, without experience, without having an assistant before, without having gone to film school, I took photographs of everything I wanted to film. Photographs were the models of the shots, and I started making films with the sole experience of photography." End quote. And that's what's interesting to Varda, or about Varda to me, is that she entered the film industry almost kind of naive, but filled with these ideas, and then she just went for it. So what do you make of all of this?
I have so many thoughts that you like sparked as you said that, and like as we go through that, like the dimension of time. And I think this is a really hilarious and sad and damning thought of like where we're at as, I don't know, a film culture or a pop culture or whatever the case may be. Also could just be a personal indictment of me as a person having problems. But like you were like, when she wanted to add time as a dimension to her photographs, I was like, sick. It's just Christopher Nolan ahead of his time. Like, you know, we had Christopher Nolan back in the 60s just living through Agnès Varda. That's what we had. So I don't know what that means, that I thought about that, and I don't know where that puts me. But I think that for her is so interesting and something that quite literally doesn't exist anymore, of like someone just being able to like try it and experiment with it. And I think a pod that I recently listened to kind of had a little bit of a talk about this, where it's like, with the studio system and how movies are made now, and the way that IP functions and the box office lives, you can't just like try stuff anymore. So like, I think it's intriguing that Varda herself was able to live in a time in which she could literally do that and just like take what she knew and try it out. And it turns out she was really, really, really good at it. And that's that. Like, I like, there's kind of like not a whole lot of like, cool, she signed a first look with Warner Brothers in the 60s, like when the studio system was growing up, and like that, like the, you know, that just wasn't part of it. So I think that's really, really interesting. And I think too, at least having seen the couple of movies that I have seen, especially with Cleo, bringing in the element of time seems like something really crucial to her and like how she understands art. There are not many films, at least not many that I can think of off the top of my head, that are like, let's just live in real time and like, let's make 13 or 15 chapters of someone, and each chapter is 6 minutes long. Like, that's revolutionary. And for her to just say like, let's put time on what is beautiful, I think is really, really interesting.
I love that you brought that up, especially the concept of playing with time in that sense, because of her documentary background, and we'll cover that a bit more. But with her love of photographs and literature, she became a major player specifically within the left bank cinema of the French New Wave. I know you said you were reading a bit about the French New Wave. Did you get to the difference between the left bank and the right bank of the movement?
Yeah, can I tell you what I think the difference is, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or right?
Please.
I think from what I read, the left bank was a little bit more of like kind of its own, like, I don't know, quote unquote, like lesser, of like a smaller kind of contingent that might have been a little like more left leaning than the right bank was. And it seems like the right bank was made up of much more populist names.
Yes.
From what I could gather. But I didn't know about that. And I think that's really, really interesting. And one of the key things that I read is like, they just supported each other, and they were just like, yo, like, let's all make movies. And that is fascinating, because when you put it in the notes, and I was like, oh, left bank, right bank, like, we must have had some cool feuds. It's like, nah, they just all liked movies, and they just they just thought a little bit differently about how to make them. And that's about it.
That's yeah. I mean, you're pretty accurate. Yeah, that's basically it. So the right bank, as you were saying, it was more well known. Like, think Truffaut, Godard, Chabrol, the directors associated with the Cahiers du Cinéma, or I mean, not all of them. I know I'm gonna get it's specific, but a lot of them wrote for the Cahiers du Cinéma. Anyway, they were younger, and I kind of cringe that I'm gonna say this, but kind of like what you were saying too. They were basically like the hipsters of the movement. And then you had the left bank, and one huge difference with the left bank is these directors were older and saw movies, or I should say they compared movies to other arts, so like literature. And so within this group, you had Alain Resnais, Chris Marquet, Varda, of course, her husbands, Demi. I think Melville could also be considered a part of the left bank too. But one thing I do want to note, or I mean, I guess you mentioned it already, is that they never clashed. They all just loved movies, right? And I mean, there were some instances where they could get a bit salty, like particularly with Godard, but I mean, he was just salty with everybody always. So yeah, but by and large, yeah, they got along. If you had to choose, I'm curious, would you pick left bank or right bank in terms of filmmakers you like?
Honestly, I would probably pick left bank based on my personal like connections and what I have seen, because of like Varda, and it does mention that her husband is sometimes grouped with this like bank of filmmakers, and the rest, like, on like total transparency, like Truffaut, Godard, like, these people are just not something that I've explored quite yet. And they're just like a little bit deeper than I've gone so far. And I've still like, you know, I've got 2 pods to host, and we've got a big MCU draft coming up. So I got to rewatch some Marvel movies. Like, this is where I'm at. And I gotta unfortunately like push off watching my first Truffaut another week, or whatever the case may be.
That's totally fine.
I'd go with the left bank, but I do think it's interesting that like that group is the group that also compared their filmmaking more so to like literature and things like that, and like how to do that in a different manner. I think I do associate more with that.
No, that's a great answer. I mean, that makes perfect sense. Also, I love the fact that you're just going to go ham on the Marvel now, and then you're going to be like, oh, Truffaut at the end of it all.
That's what you got to do
Amazing.
sometimes. You got to go hard on the IP and then dial it back for some French New Wave. That's
love
just
it.
the ebbs and flows of cinema consumption.
Amazing, amazing. So with La Pointe Courte and Varda, it's also interesting really quickly to mention that Alain Resnais was so excited by the footage he saw in the film early on, because remember, she's done nothing else, literally nothing else before, and he's the one that taught Varda how to edit. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I think that's just an interesting tidbit. But nevertheless, the film was not financially successful, and as a result, Varda made short films for the next 7 years before finally releasing Cléo from 5 to 7 in 1962. And before we chat about Cléo, I'm not going to go through her entire filmography, but I do want to note some just like wildly impressive accolades. She received an honorary Palme d'Or at the 2015 Cannes Film Festival, becoming the first woman to win the award. She also received an Academy Honorary Award, a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature for Faces Places. Did I say Faces Places? Anyway, Faces Places. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because she was the oldest person to be nominated for a competitive Oscar. And then in 2017, she became the first female director to win her own honorary Oscar. So, I mean, that's just bananas, all that I just listed, right? I mean,
that is honestly insane stuff. And like, to me, being kind of a little bit less connected to like the French New Wave in general, and just like starting to dip my toes and watching films like this and like Jacques Demy films and Young Girls of Rochefort and what have you, I'm like, oh, cool. Like, these are all French films from the 60s. Like, they must have been great directors back then. And then you're like, she lived until 2019 and she has all these awards. And, and like learning that is kind of like a big like world collapse for me, because I'm just like, oh my god, she just passed away like 5 years ago. Meanwhile, like, her film is 60 years old, and we're like, this is one of the greats. I think is really a weird concept for me to still be like, because when I looked her up on Criterion, and I had DM'd you of like, what should I watch on the plane? Like, that's Varda. I looked her up on Criterion. She's got all these like things from 2014, 2008, 2006, and I was like, are these like, these can't be her, right? Like, there's no way. And then I did some more investigating, and I was like, damn, she was cooking for 65 years. Good for her.
Forever. Yeah, I mean, you could say the same thing with the directors from like the new Hollywood movement, like Scorsese. I mean, granted, he started a bit later, but still. Side note, did you know that Scorsese was friends with Varda? Like, they were tight.
Sick. Just love to hear it. Makes total sense. Happy for my boy Marty, That's great.
They met in 1977, I think it was, and he was so inspired by her. He called her one of the gods, and they remained in touch. Apparently, in 2016, for Silence, she was in the editing room. She also visited him on set of The Irishman. Like, they were pals. Like, he told
That's
the Hollywood.
Insane.
I know. He told the Hollywood
cool.
Reporter that like, she's my biggest inspiration, because the biggest thing he took away from her was the fact that there are no rules. That was the key to her work. And I mean, I just love that little side note.
That is so interesting. I know we're going to talk about the movie, but like, if I can just very, very quickly, like, bring up this idea of no rules, because you mentioned it, like, the first time, even the second time, when Cleo's walking down the staircase, and that style of editing we get where it like replays the same thing 4 times, where I was just like, like, the first time I saw it, I was like, did we skip? Like, what happened? Like, did my streaming service go wrong? And I was like, no, Varda's just a goddamn genius at work. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, it's just crazy. She's just great. So yeah, I mean, this just brings us to Cléo now. So shall we get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, okay. So Cléo from 5 to 7. Movie follows a beautiful pop singer, Cléo, who we later discover isn't even her real name. I think it's Florence. But so we follow her in real time as she awaits the results of a recent biopsy, which will tell her whether or not she has cancer. I should also note that the title is 5 to 7. Technically, the film takes us only to 6:30. Did you notice this?
I did notice this. Yes, I did. And I don't know if it's on Letterboxd in particular, but there is somewhere where you can like read the synopsis of the film. And I think in parentheses, it like says like really it's only from 5 to 6:30. And I was like, ooh, that's an interesting little like tidbit going into the film. But I did notice this, yes.
I feel like I mean, I don't know why, but I feel like it doesn't have the same ring to it. Like Cleo from 5 to 6:30 just
No.
does not work.
I was going to ask you, like, why do you think she did from 5 to 7 if it's really only from 5 to 6:30? Like, she could have said, like, Cleo after 5. You know what I mean? Like, there could have been something else. I'm curious if it was strictly like, I don't know, I like the way 5 to 7 sounds. But again, the way she experiments with time and the way she thinks about time, this idea from 5 to 7, even though we get to 6:30, I'm positive that's her like insinuating something about those last 30 minutes, right? Of like, time stands still now that we have, now that we realize what we know.
Yes, that, but also and we're going to get into this, of course, but she has to walk that guy to the station.
She does. Oh, so this is what we don't see from 6:30 to 7.
Yes, maybe.
Fascinating.
That just came to me. I could very well be wrong, but
no, that would make sense. I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. But so where did I stop? So we just discussed the movie. Okay. So yeah, I think it's just super clever to shoot it this way, that nothing is omitted, because we just watch Cleo walk through Paris. She goes shopping. She wastes away at her apartment and she has a recording session. She goes on walks and so on and so forth. But I do want to know one thing about the time in the film. Were you paying attention to the clocks in the movie throughout?
Not necessarily. Not that I have like any recollection of.
Okay, I'm gonna blow your mind. So one thing that's cool about the movie, and I geek out over this so much, so I know you will too, but the watches and the clocks in the streets, in the apartments, match the story and the time in the story.
Oh my gosh. Sick. I'm just gonna rewatch it tonight now, just for the clocks.
Right? Just because like the precision, because again, it's a new wave movie, so it's shot on location. It's not in a studio. So when she's at the fortune teller, for example, there's a clock behind her. It reads 5:05 as she's crying. Then 5:08. There's a clock when she enters the cafe. Again, not a film studio. It matches in the cafe. When she's in the cab, they pass by a clock outside on the street that matches the time. Like the precision that this would have taken. It's just crazy.
That's phenomenal too, because so much of this takes place in like long shots through the streets or through the taxi or like in the cafe for minutes on end, where I mean, like Agnès would have had to put so much attention to detail into that. And like just coming at it from my perspective, like kind of circling back to what I said earlier of like the studio system and filmmakers now and like Hollywood and all this kind of stuff. Like I am constantly on the lookout for goofs and for like mess ups in films where I'm just like, oh, like guys, come on, like you know, you guys have like assistants and DPs for a reason. Like you guys should solve this on a frame by frame basis. And to know that like Agnès was just like, yo, let's bring our camera to France and like Paris and like we'll just get this right. And that is sensational to me. Something that absolutely doesn't exist now in modern filmmaking.
No, absolutely. It'd be like, let's fix this in post. Let's fix this clock that says like 7 a.m.
And there's like there's a very prominent shot in Cleo that's done of like her kind of walking around a corner, I believe, and we get like a kind of a big clock tower.
Yes.
And like I was like, this is brilliant. Like I obviously didn't notice the time, but I was like, I get it. Like time, we're living this, and it totally makes sense. And that to even just like get that shot, like that's a public clock. Like I don't know. I think it is really kind of mind-blowing.
Absolutely. Not to do it once, but to do it like I don't even know how many times. But anyway, so with the movie, as we said at the start, it's easy to think about the film solely about mortality and Cleo's fear of death. But I do think it's so much more than that. It is this journey of self-discovery for her and to come into her own, to get rid of this like gaze of others that she sees herself through. What do you think?
I totally agree. I think it's initially framed very poignantly as like she is very scared to die. Like this is where we are at, because obviously when we get the introduction, we get the tarot cards, all of that is in color, and then we see Cleo in her life in black and white, which I think is a really interesting artistic decision. And we see the fortune teller tell her man in the closet, whoever that person is, that like she's gonna die. This is no good. she's toast. And so like we are introduced to her in her life as she's like really, really scared and sad of like what's going to happen. And pretty quickly it feels like we have a big tonal shift, especially the first time that comes to mind is when she's in the cafe initially and she gets sitting down. It's the first time, I believe, that we hear her overhearing another conversation and a boyfriend and a girlfriend of like, I'm sick of leaving your place late. Like, why can't we just like live together or whatever the case is? And that is, to me, like the very first subtle tonal shift of like, oh, she's trying to figure out what this means to her in terms of not just death and not just a fear of dying, but like how would other people take this news? How do other people live? Like what will I do with the time that I have left? And like starting to kind of flip that on its head a little bit, which to me is the most fascinating part of the film, and something that I left in my most recent review is actually something she overhears somebody say, because I think that tells us the most about how she's changing her thought process of the world around her as she gets theoretically closer to dying.
That's interesting that you bring that up. I wasn't even going to bring that up, but I think you're absolutely right. That is kind of when that shift starts going on. But to go back to your previous point with the fortune teller, one thing that I think is interesting is that the fortune teller, she makes a point to tell Cleo that the card doesn't necessarily mean death. It doesn't have to. It could be a transformation. Yeah. And I personally, I see that as a clue, the first clue in the film that the film is not about death and that it is about transformation, because Varda herself has also said that people have asked her, like, why do you start the film in color and then it goes in black and white? And she goes, because it's fiction. The fiction is in the color that then draws us into the rest of the film, which is reality, 90 minutes of reality. So she mentioned at the time as well that there was this collective fear and obsession in the real world with cancer and heart troubles. I mean, as there is now, but particularly then. And so it was a reality. And so to choose to shoot your movie like that, I don't know. I mean, I think it is about transformation and so much more, all done through that first scene.
I agree. And I think during that card scene as well, it's really interesting that the first time she's trying to have it read, if I'm remembering correctly, the fortune teller even says like, you didn't come up in the cards, let's redraw. Like, let's redo this thing. So like, it is really not about death. It is really about Cleo just trying to understand her life better and connect with who she is at her core, because the first round doesn't even have death in it. Like death is just our our launching pad into a mode of self-discovery.
Yeah.
Right. So I do think that introduction is really interesting.
I also do want to mention very briefly, and I'm sure we'll touch on it again and over and over and over again throughout this, but with the way that the movie is shot, it almost feels like a documentary of Paris as well, which I think you even mentioned at the start when you were like, oh, you can look at it as this movie about all this stuff, but you could also look at it as let's just walk around Paris. So I do want to pause and mention some stuff here too pertaining to that sense of it feeling like a documentary. The film obviously had a small budget like other new wave movies. Varda actually received financial backing from the producer of Godard's Breathless and Demi's Lola. But anyway, I know, just interesting. But as we said, it was shot on location in Paris, in apartments, streets, cafes, parks. And so the people you see are, of course, non-actors. Even in the cafes that we see, the majority of the people, not all of them, but the majority are paying customers. And so it really is a portrait of Paris. And Varda herself has called it a portrait of a young woman, or a portrait of a woman painted onto a documentary about Paris. What do you think? Isn't that cool?
Yeah, I think that's really neat. I think that is really something special, at least with the movies that I've watched from this movement. Young Girls of Rochefort obviously being one of them. And I just recently got told about a movie that is very like in similar vein to this, where it's basically like nothing is scripted. It's just a person walking through the streets of Paris having conversations with real people. That idea of being able to create movies like that in the 60s that totally encapsulate not only like a Paris that is not available anymore, but like a sense of realism that kind of isn't really available anymore in cinema is really special. And I think in terms of like what Agnès Varda is able to accomplish, it is a really fascinating dichotomy to come at it with this movie and say, like, she had barely like kind of made anything before this, and like she's new-ish, right, quote unquote, but her self-confidence is through the roof because she's like, let's just go to this cafe and make it happen. And I think that is like raw filmmaking at its total height. And to be able to blend these genres like Varda does is not something that we really see elsewhere, especially like in this time period. I think it's a really cool capturing moment.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Just, yeah, just the guts on this woman to do all of this is just so commendable. But back to the story. So, yeah, we're going in chronological order. So she's leaving the fortune teller now. And again, fortune teller says, listen, it could be a transformation, doesn't have to be death. Cleo is horrified. I feel like she's too paralyzed by fear to realize that it could be anything else. And then that starts to shift and change, as you were saying, as we go throughout the movie. And as she's leaving the fortune teller's apartment, she goes down the staircase. And you mentioned as well the jump cuts.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this was almost touching on Cleo's mental state, which is fragmenting after this news. What do you think?
That's really interesting. I hadn't really dissected it on a level like that. I had really just viewed it as like, okay, cool. She feels like time is now a repetition. She feels now like it's not like a linear thing moving forward for her that can invoke evolution or transformation or whatever she had initially planned in life. It's now kind of on a loop because like even if she goes to the cafe, even if she hears a new conversation, even if she goes back to her apartment, she does these things. She stretches out from time to, every day. She says her one-liner to her friend every day. She mentions it. You're my best audience. Like, these are things she does on a regular occasion. And so I guess to me, I was like, oh, cool. Like, that's just a little visual signifier of like, she feels like nothing's new. And she feels like she'll never get the opportunity to have anything new because of this news. And then obviously we get, the relationship towards the end of the film that kind of evaporates that idea. But that's how I had viewed it initially.
I love that. See, I didn't even think of that. That didn't even cross my mind. So this is why I like having a guest on with another opinion. That's just, I mean, it could also mean that. It could mean what I said. It could mean what you said. It could mean both things. We should also mention that soon after this, we get the first look at a major motif in the film, and that's mirrors and reflections. When she leaves the fortune teller, we hear her inner monologue as she looks at herself in the mirror and she says something like, as long as I'm beautiful, I'll be more alive than any of them. And we see a lot of her looking at those mirrors throughout, right?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting too. And like, I hate that I keep doing this, but I also think it's interesting. And if it's interesting to me, it might be interesting to somebody else. But like this kind of ahead of its time idea of like a new pristine movie star Hollywood of like beauty trumps all. Like that's what we are here to accomplish on the silver screen is like beautiful Hollywood stars making movies, and that's what movies are really about in the 60s and 70s and moving forward. And it kind of invoked the at least thematic idea, and I cannot believe I'm going to say this, but it invoked the thematic idea in Babylon when Brad Pitt's character has the conversation right with that woman, and basically like this idea that your beauty and your on-screen presence will live far beyond what your physical body will be ever able to do. And so for Cleo to see herself and say like, as long as I'm beautiful, I'm happier than anybody. I think that is like a real fork in the road, a la like a real reflection of where she's at mentally. That's fair to like believe that. It's also like pretty tragic for her to just be like, well, if I'm good looking, I guess that's all. I guess we're good to go. Like, I guess that's all that matters in life right now. But like, it's a really interesting kind of interlacing of those ideas because like she is a gorgeous woman. Like she has the male gaze on a very continual basis throughout the film. And so to interlope those two things of like, is beauty good? Like, is beauty all that matters, or is there more to understanding happiness? I think both can be true.
No, I completely agree with you. There's just that push. Like it's just such a layered film because then you connect that idea that Cleo has that society will only value her while she's beautiful with the theme of time and death. And it's that push and pull between the idea of beauty and the passage of time.
Yeah.
So how all of that relates to mortality, I mean, it's just fascinating. You can pick it apart from so many different levels. So what's next?
Really, that's my goal in life, is just to die while I'm hot. That's kind of all I want to do. So Cleo was the mold for all of us.
She truly was. You know Jordan Firstman, the actor and social media guy?
I do not. No, I'll have to look him up.
He just starred in a movie called, fuck, I can't remember the name right now. It was a really, really good film. Rotting in the Sun.
Okay.
But so he also did, like, on the Criterion page, the collection page, not the channel website. There's like actors who pick their 5 top favorite movies, and he picked Cleo as one of his, and that was the other thing, like just how hot she is and how she wants to live before she dies. I thought that was funny.
I mean, I think that's incredible, and like it's a huge idea and theme, at least for me personally, of like this wave of films. Like, I just don't think people get any more beautiful than like mid-60s French films.
Same.
Like, I just don't think it can ever be done. And like, you look at modern movie stars and everything, and like, yes, there are gorgeous people out there, and like all of us obsess over them all the time and every day. But it's like, have you seen this movie? Like, have you seen Belle de Jour? Like, it doesn't get better than that kind of a thing, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, that guy's based for that opinion. That's a good one.
Absolutely. Oh my god, yeah, Belle de Jour, Catherine Deneuve.
Oh,
but
yeah.
anyway,
don't even get me started. That's a different pod.
That's different pod. Come back for that one. That'd be great. Yeah. So after the fortune teller, Cleo meets her assistant, Angel. Assistant maid, maybe the same thing. She meets her at a cafe, regardless, and she tells her the results of the tarot card reading while sobbing. And here we get the first glimpse of how others perceive Cleo. Her assistant has that inner monologue we hear that says Cleo is like a child, she needs to be looked after. And then as Angel is talking to the waiter or waiters, we see Cleo listening to that other conversation that you mentioned earlier. Is there anything you wanted to add to that little cafe segment?
There are 2 very brief things. What I wrote down from that scene is that like Cleo and her hysterics kind of like rear their head when her maid believes like she could just choose to be happy, which I do think is like a kind of an evergreen theme of like real life, as well as it is in films, of when it comes to like receiving dire medical news. Like, you know, people from the outside, it's like, okay, like, yeah, that's hard, but like, you know, we're at a cafe in Paris, like, let's be a little happy, which I think is like extremely dark to like traverse that idea. And then the second one, the second point I wanted to mention was, I just think it's an interesting directorial decision that we do not hear the entirety of that story that she is telling the waiter. And I know we don't hear it because we go into Cleo and like what she hears, but both times I watched this film, I was like, I wonder what like the rest of that story was, because I wonder if hearing the rest of that story lines up with Cleo, because obviously she takes some mode of subconscious inspiration from that, I feel like, towards the end of the film, of like, let's travel and like let's just do cool things. But I, you know, just like shout out to the guy in the story. You know, I'm happy for you, and I would have loved to hear the whole thing.
Damn.
That's my
a
takeaway.
Good point. I love that takeaway. I think this is also a moment, the first moment where we first start to notice, or it becomes obvious, that Cleo is lonely. And also the first instance where we see the male characters brush off her dilemma. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of people that would, like, you tell them this hard news and them being like, oh, don't worry, it's everything's going to be fine, easier said than done. But so they leave the cafe and they go stroll down the street and eventually go hat shopping. And again, as they're walking, we see that she's constantly being watched by both men and women, actually. And I'm sure that can get overwhelming. I think that the film does such a great job at portraying that uncomfiness of being watched and observed. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting subtext here too that's really not played up a lot in the movie, I don't feel like, but it is the very like factual presence that she's a pop star. Like she's on the radio, right? Like I mean, unless I misunderstood. So like she is not, I mean, I guess she's like not famous, but like
Mm-hmm.
that does something to her mental state for sure.
Mm-hmm.
To be like, I'm on the radio and like let's joke about how my voice sounds so bad. Like that's a special level of self-reflection that I don't think a lot of people get to experience. And so to know that when she goes out in public, both men and women are either seeing a pop star and so gazing at her for that idea of like, oh, I know who that is, or even the fact of like, wow, there's this beautiful woman walking by me, you know, that could lead to a litany of other themes and conversations and thoughts. But like probably the most prominent one is like, she must be so happy. And like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you and I do that all the time, right? Like, dang, that's a good looking guy. I'm sure he's got a happy life. And like,
Yeah.
maybe he just goes home like Cleo and is like really, really lonely and sad. We just don't know. So I think like to kind of start to explore that and break that down a little bit and to not do it too much, I think is really interesting, because like she only goes to the cafe for a little bit of time. She only goes hat shopping for a little bit of time. Like she's only in these modes for brief instances. And so I think that like tells a lot about how much of that she can handle.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you entirely. I think it's also worthwhile noting that even though throughout the film we see so many people watching her, and we'll cover this later on more, we also see her staring at people, and old women in particular, I think, which could serve as her own reminder that her beauty will fade, either, you know, of old age, or if this cancer diagnosis is positive and will lead to something bad, we don't know. So I think that these shots signify that Cleo is constantly observing herself through this lens of how others see her. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100% agree. And I do think that like mirrors are always a really, I guess they've been used for a really long time, obviously, but I always think they're a nice, like, clever visual Easter egg. Like, you know, I think something like that is really not done a whole lot anymore, where I think it means a lot. And obviously at one point in time she does look into a mirror that's cracked. And so I think like you can say a lot without saying anything at all. And Varda does a beautiful job of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's
I
exceptional.
couldn't agree more. Yeah. And so with that, they then go to the hat shop. I wish it was a cat shop. Cleo buys a black fur hat in the middle of the summer. Okay.
Slay queen. Like, I don't know. You do you. You know?
This reminds me, side note, I went to Amsterdam one year and it was warm, and I bought a massive Sherpa coat from like top to bottom, and then wore it back on the plane home because I was like, this is a steal.
That's a move right there. I'm proud of you for that. Channel your inner Cleo.
Oh yeah, always. So she's at this shop, and there's a moment where the shopkeeper discovers that Cleo is a singer and she wants her autograph, and you can kind of see Cleo basking in her fame, I would say, very briefly, although like you said. And so this takes us to the cab ride, where now Cleo and her assistant are heading to Cleo's home for rehearsal. We get more insight during the cab ride. As you said, we hear whatever song's playing on the radio, and she gets upset because she hates the recording.
Yeah.
We also hear news coverage of the war going on in Algeria. And I think most telling, to me at least, is the conversation with the female taxi driver as she chats about her job and whether or not it's dangerous. So here we see that Cleo herself, as our protagonist, lives a life by these stereotypical ideals. She's not this representation of feminism at all. Do you know where I'm going with this?
Mm-hmm. I'm listening in delight.
Oh, I love it. So while the cab driver gets into this like nitty gritty of her own safety when it comes to male customers, she sees herself as independent and strong. Cleo later tells her assistant that she found the cab driver's attitude to be revolting. Yeah. And Angel kind of counters, and she's like, well, no, it's kind of a breath of fresh air, basically. And Cleo just can't see that. And she can't see it as any form of empowerment. While Angel, on the other hand, sees it as this wonderful example that women can take on roles that are usually reserved for men. So it's an interesting contrast, I think. Is there anything you want to add about this cab ride bit?
This cab ride, for me, works on 3 different thematic levels. And I think they all kind of envelop the idea of what's a big deal to you? Like, what's a big deal in your life right now? You know? And I think, so like, Cleo obviously receiving the news of her potential cancer, you know, or whatever, potential medical diagnosis from the cards. Like that's kind of like one little layer. Then obviously with the taxi driver, her world and her like empowerment of being able to do that job, that's kind of another layer that Cleo is not privy to and has not never like thought of what what is essentially like this kind of like lower level citizenship of what it means to be a woman in Paris. And then the third level of the news on the radio, and I took that as just like a massive juxtaposition of like, cool, like there's just an absolute like war going on, people are dying, like you're listening to the news of all of these world travesties, and meanwhile you're like, you got to change the station, my voice, that was a bad recording. And I think like we're on like, very different levels of like what is bad in my world right now, kind of a thing. And so I always find that really interesting from that perspective. And the long shot in the taxi with like the very what I would assume, and you might know better than I because I haven't read any like behind the scenes or anything, but I would assume like we're like where the film runs out or like canister switches basically of like during the long shot, because you get a pretty like stark cut all of a sudden, but it is definitely designed or intentionally designed to feel like it did not cut, I think is so cool. Because like we just live in that really kind of muddy, yucky idea of like what's important, I don't know, kind of a thing.
Oh, I love that you brought up specifically. I didn't think of that, but you're so on the money with that. The three layers of like importance, or what's important in your life. I think that's so fascinating, especially with the war being chatted about too versus Cleo's song recording. So thank you for that. So
do what I can.
Amazing. So we finally get to Cleo's home. Before we get into this scene, oh my God, this apartment. I remember the first time I saw it, my jaw was on the floor. It's so beautiful.
Oh,
so much light.
It is unbelievably gorgeous. I literally paused the movie and called in my wife and I was like, look at this apartment, huh? Pretty cool. And then, and then she immediately like proceeds to put on this lovely, like fuzzy kind of overthrow thing. And I was like, yo, Molly, when are we getting one of those for the house? Like, when are we both getting to wear one of these around the home? It looks lavish and fantastic.
Yeah, she has the swing. She has like, I think like 2 kittens running around. I'm like, come on, man. Like this is, I don't know about rental prices where you are, but over here, that apartment would cost like apartment a leg.
Yeah, I'm talking like, that's like $1 million. That's insane.
Not in either of our futures, at least not short term.
Unfortunately.
So we see Cleo and Angel in there, and much how Cleo seems to come across like a living doll at the start of the film, her home also feels that way as well. We also get examples of how spoiled she is here. Like her assistant helps her get undressed, and then Cleo kind of drops her clothes to the ground without care. And then her assistant helps her get dressed again, and so on and so forth. And then her boyfriend, or I guess situationship, we could call it, he comes in briefly. What happens first? No, Angel first tells Cleo not to tell him that she's sick because men hate illness. Eye roll. Questionable. So
wild takes back then. It was just like, don't annoy this guy with anything. Just like, don't say a word. But Cleo does bring this up in the taxi, I believe, like right beforehand, of like, I'm just expected to like look beautiful all the time and just be ready to essentially like ready to go whenever, kind of a thing. And that is definitely played up here in this scene for sure.
Totally. And I mean, she ends up telling him that she's sick. I mean, she doesn't go into detail, but she does tell him, and he doesn't take her seriously. What did you think of this guy?
Well, this is interesting because, and I'm not defending this guy at all. I think he's a pretty terrible person, honestly. But I think this scene is really fascinating to talk about and like break down, because this film is about it's about Cleo told from a woman's perspective, right? And like this man comes in, and to me, what I read, like the entire package of this film shifts for like these 6 minutes. It's really the only time we kind of get a big soaring score. It's the only time that I can remember that we get really fluid camera movements, walking around the bed, moving around them, essentially turning their conversation and their situationship into that of a dream, right? And like, this is lovely. This is what we want. This is what she wants. This is what he wants. Like, it's nice to be loved and to be happy and all of these things. And then obviously when he goes away, that does a hard cut, and we go back to Cleo's point of view and her life and the way she sees things. This guy is the worst, and I don't know. Doesn't he say something along the terms of like, "You never like really kiss me that long," and that annoys me. I'm pretty sure he says something about
Does he?
I'm pretty sure he says something about like we don't kiss enough, and she's like, "Well, I could kiss more if you'd like," and he's like, "Nah, don't worry about it." And I'm like, guy, like probably the most gorgeous human on the planet right now is like literally in her bed with kittens, looking beautiful, and is like is actively pushing away her dire future for her to be like, let's make out, and he's like, nah, just he's like, fuck you, let's forget about this. I'm not in the mood. It's basically how it is, and it's like it's a real hard tonal shift between between men and women and how they view the futile moments of their lives.
Absolutely. Oh, he was the worst. Yeah, he like always says he doesn't have time for because he has appointments to go to. I'm like, dude, shuffle your appointments.
Yeah, you got to move that calendar, brother.
Yeah, man.
Come on.
Oh, so he leaves, thank God. And then we finally see Cleo's pianist, Bob, and her songwriter, Maurice, come over to rehearse. Did you catch...
All-time cinematic duo, quite honestly.
Going to say, so did you catch who the pianist, Bob, was played by?
No, I didn't know.
Oh, more mind-boggling for you, my friend. It is Michel Legrand, the Michel Legrand, one of my favorite composers, who famously worked with Demi on The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, The Young Girls of Rochefort. He did the music in Cleo, of course, but that is him. And
dude, that's incredible. That is so good. What a guy. Just what a guy.
What a guy. And I adore Legrand so much. I've watched some videos and documentaries of him like actually coming up for songs with filmmakers, and he really is that charming and jovial. Like he is just
interesting.
That guy. So yeah, I love that little tidbit. Mm-hmm.
I love the fact that they decide to dress up in medical gear, like fake medical gear. And I think you could unpack a lot there of like, again, like how they view it versus how Cleo views it. And like her maid tells them like, please don't do this. And they're like, well, we're going to do it anyway. And kind of use it to break the ice with Cleo. They are so funny the whole time to me. And I do think the guy not at the piano, the guy that's like the lyricist that comes up with the stuff, kind of a sad guy as well. Like I felt bad for him, especially in juxtaposition to the guy that we just saw that like Cleo's theoretically in love with or like has a fling with. This guy, his teeth are not looking great. He's sad. He's like on the other side of the piano, and he's like, okay, if you don't want to play it, or like if you don't want to sing, that's okay with me. And it's like, oh man, oh my God, like this is so sad. And you know, he goes along with the joke and all these things. I think it's a lovely moment of the movie, and 100% like a direct reflection of, you know, the fluid camera movement and the soaring score that we just got, and now it's in a different modality with her as the centerpiece with these two guys, and the way she sings that exceptionally dire song so beautifully is like 100% Varda's bag of what she does. She's like, look at this beautiful thing, isn't it so sad? And it literally is so sad.
Oh, I also just that song in itself, Sans Toi. When I first watched Cleo from 5 to 7 for the first time, I found that song afterwards on Spotify, and I just looped it for hours and hours and hours. Clearly, I wasn't feeling well either. But it's a beautiful cinematic moment. Like you said, we see the camera fluidly zoom into Cleo's face. Everything else fades. We hear those strings come in. I mean, I get chills watching this scene. And apparently, according to Varda, when that moment was filmed, everyone on set was moved. So
that's like, I feel like that would be a moment where if you're behind the camera in any capacity, you're like, we got it. Like we did it. This is what we're trying to capture. And they definitely did it.
It's stunning. And so Cleo then flips out after the song. She interprets it as the men making fun of her for feeling out of sorts. And again, we hear her pianist call her a spoiled child. Again, so this, I think now the second or third person that calls her spoiled, right? I think so.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to quickly, I just looked at my notes as well. And when they sing this song, there's a really interesting decision from Varda to swing the camera with the music to the people's faces. Like swing it in a sense where it's like, we're not like editing or getting cuts to people's faces. We're literally like, as if the camera was swinging from person to person with the kind of with the energy of the song. And like that is something I've really just like never seen done anywhere else, where it does feel like that's a decision where Agnès is like, okay, this is the energy I want to capture, and this is the only way the camera can move. Even if it's a little bit weird and new and maybe a little disorienting, like this is what we're doing, and this is how they're all playing together cohesively. And that's how we're visually going to tell that story is really cool.
Yeah, I'm so happy you brought that up because I made a note of that as well, and then I just completely forgot to bring it up. But it was also her assistance on the swing too. So you had the third layer as well, right? I'm pretty sure she's also swinging on the swing as the camera's also so much swinging. I love it. Yeah, wow, I'm so happy you brought that up. This is good. We're doing a good job. And so, yeah, so she finishes the song or songs. She sings a couple. And yeah, Cleo's unhappy. She's like, you're all making fun of me pretty much. And then her pianist calls her spoiled. And then she makes a point to say that everyone spoils her, but nobody loves her. What are your thoughts? Because I have plenty as well.
I think that's a really, it's tough because again, like I am coming at this from like a male's perspective. And so like there might be certain things that I don't see or connect with. So like, that's just like, you know, a little warning of like, if I read this differently than you do, it to me really highlights Cleo's self-consumption nature of like, I'm choosing not to be happy. Like I'm just choosing to never get what I want. And I think that's why she gets called spoiled a lot, is because maybe people can read through that. And like, maybe people can see like, look at what we're doing for you. And you're still choosing to say at the end of the day, like, you guys are making fun of me. And so like at some point, these guys have to, you know, last straw that broke the camel's back situation where it's like, God, we put so much effort into this. Like you're kind of being a little spoiled, and like just choose to be happy. But you know, there's obviously an inverse reading of that too. And a lot to think about in terms of what Cleo's trying to say.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you're wrong at all. I think we just like pulled different things, which again, huge reason why I wanted to have you come on. But I think that this entire segment is really Varda commenting on gender inequality and how others perceive Cleo, which in turn affects how she sees herself. So similar to what you're saying, but kind of different. We see how her boyfriend just brushes her off, right? Then we see Angel encourage Cleo to remain with him because he's successful and good looking. Then we see how the musicians she works with also brush her off. And she says she's sick of it all they say that it's almost like a cry for attention, right? They call her spoiled. And then Cleo also makes a point to tell Bob that he's never taught her how to write her own songs or something of the sort, either write her own songs or something like that. But so she's basically viewed as a child, and maybe that's what people think of her. And so that's what she gives them in return. Right. She's like, this is what you guys make of me. This is what I'm going to give you. Like, screw you, basically. And then she finally snaps because she's sick of it all.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I mean, thematically, it would definitely connect to what happens in the cafe with her maid saying, like, she's basically a child to be attended to. And you're totally right. Like, if you nourish that person with that, that's how they're going to receive their world and the things around them and who they should be, right? So I think you're spot on with that, and it is a pretty stark call out to the music man, to the music men that are like, you know, doing these songs of like, she makes a good point, like, how come you guys just like don't teach me how to do this stuff? You know, which is like totally fair. Like, she's not treated as an equal player in that kind of trinity of art.
Exactly. And I think that this scene is also very important because at the end of it all, she does snap, and you see the change in her at the end of the scene. She has this little tantrum. She whips off her wig, and and that's kind of when this transformation starts, with the wig ripping.
Which is really interesting too, in terms of like the thematic ideas of beauty, and like she chooses ? Like, quote unquote, to like to live like that and to see herself like that, when in fact she could not wear a wig, or she could just wear black all the time, right? If like that, if that's really how she feels, which is like a really interesting point to kind of bring up in the middle of everything. A movie that like has literally a billion different directions you could go for every single scene of the film.
Absolutely. And then there's also, so she rips off the wig, then she announces she wants to be alone and she goes for a
Yeah.
walk. And that as well is also a big deal because now during the walk, she finally starts looking at the world around her. And I mean, also, we haven't seen her walk alone up until that point, but so she's wearing these sunglasses now, which make her more anonymous. And throughout this walk, we also get shots of people in her life looking directly at the camera. I'm curious what you thought of that, of the shots of the people looking at her.
I love it. Well, I think it's really,
Mm.
really cool. And I think it's a really great, it's not like a wall break of any sorts, but it is absolutely a damning situation for the viewer to be like, hey, you're
Mm.
part of this. Like you're watching her life
Ooh.
too. And so like to see them looking either directly back at you or at Cleo, however you kind of want to like perceive that, is this idea of like you're caught up in whatever Cleo is caught up in as well. And like you're a willing participant in however people treat her, because obviously as a viewer you have no say in that, but like
Yeah.
you're watching it happen. And so like for them to look at you is in some part, I think, a really brilliant folding in of a viewer to say like, wow, you are also at the center of this.
Wow, you just blew my mind with that. That's not at all where my mind went, but that is now where my mind will go the
It's
next time I watch
it's
this.
either brilliant or dumb. So you pick
No,
whatever side you want to be on that one.
it's so good. It's so good because my theory wasn't that well thought out. For me, I thought those shots were just maybe Cleo thinking about all of this, about how people perceive her.
Oh,
Like she
interesting.
sees
Yeah.
them, how they perceive her, and then starting to change her mind about it all. It's almost like it's all clicking for her, you know?
Interesting. Yeah. No, I mean, for sure. I think it goes both ways too.
Yeah. God, yeah, we did good.
Nice.
I
We got
love
it
the
right.
constant praise. This is good. So she goes to this cafe and people watches more. She also passes by a street performer twice who swallows frogs and then projectiles them.
We have to talk about this guy. What the fuck is
Please.
this guy on? I'm sorry if I can't swear, but that's insane.
Yeah, you
Whatever
can.
this guy is doing is
It's
truly
disgusting.
deranged behavior. What
When
is it?
he projectiled the water back.
That was sick. That was sick. Like, honestly, it's a great take on where we have stooped to in terms of our expectation for street performers nowadays. Like, I don't see any guys swallowing frogs out on the corner anymore. Like, what happened? What happened? That's tough beat for street performers nowadays.
It's disgusting. I think they were also alive still. Like those frogs are alive.
Oh, they're definitely alive. Yeah, it's pretty it's pretty gross, and I don't know, like even talking about it I'm like, I don't like what are we trying to do here? Are we just experiencing Paris through Cleo's eyes? Like this is what she catches on to, and this is what's interesting to her? I don't know.
I think so. I think it was, honestly, it could have just been what they came across on the street that day in Paris.
Oh, yeah, that's totally fair. And it also could be, again, like the idea of how Cleo perceives how other people live their lives. Like, this guy's swallowing frogs and he's one happy dude. Like, why can't I be happy? I'm just at the cafe. I'm not even swallowing frogs. So, it could fall in that vein as well.
Maybe. Who knows? She does see him twice. So, food for thought. Lots to
yeah, she does. Wild.
So she passes by the frogman, and then what does she do next? She goes to visit her old friend, Dorothy, who is a nude model for a sculpting class. And Cleo observes her friend as she finishes up and then asks her, she's really curious. She's like, how do you, Dorothy, feel about your job? Because I would feel very exposed and uncomfortable. And Dorothy says something interesting, that her body makes her happy, not proud. And so I think that Dorothy is kind of similar to the cab driver earlier we mentioned, female cab driver, where she lives her life on her own terms and takes control of it. She's, we see that in the way she acts throughout this entire segment. She's light, she's happy. We meet her boyfriend because they go visit him at the theater he works at. And even their relationship is total polar opposite to Cleo and whoever that guy was that visited her. Dorothy basically just lives on her own terms, not those of others, and you can see how much happier she is. And I think that's what Varda is trying to showcase. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really great takedown of maybe fulfillment versus happiness versus societal expectations of how you should be happy. Like, in theory, Cleo's got it all. She's a pop star. She's beautiful. She lives in Paris in the 60s. Like, that's the life. You're doing it. And at this time, with what little I know of history and where things were, like, being a nude model, probably not that, like, excited in terms of, like, societal viewpoints, right? Of like, wow, you're the best of the best. Like, that's as good as the job gets. So I do think it's a really great breakdown of that. And I think it's supposed to, like, tell Cleo there's a stark difference and you can choose where you go with this. Like, sometimes doing things that make you happy can be different than things that you, when you turn 85, think are fulfilling. Like, I think there's a very stark difference there. I did want to really, really fast say at the cafe, the one quote that I wrote down from this movie was something she overhears, I believe, and it's all these stories we simply can't understand. And I believe that's just, think I'm like a mother talking to her son, or maybe like two lovers or something like that. And it's very brief and it's very quiet. But to me, it is like exceptionally prominent of the point of the movie of like, we have no idea. Like, Cleo's got no clue what everybody at the cafe is doing. Cleo, frankly, has no idea why people are looking at her. They could be any span of things, right? Like, that they're thinking about while doing that. And to this point, like, all these stories we can't understand, her friend is happy. Like, I don't know if we necessarily need to know why she got there, but she is, and that's okay to be that sometimes.
Yeah, I'm so happy you highlighted that cafe scene too and kind of tied it back to this, because you're absolutely right. And I also think that her friend Dorothy is the first person to genuinely express concern and care when Cleo tells her, yo, there's a biopsy and I don't know how this is gonna go.
Yeah.
So yeah, she's an interesting character. And what happens next? They get to the theater that her boyfriend works at, Raoul. And then we suddenly get to watch a film within a film. Feels like a little Chaplin tribute. Silent film, none other than Jean-Luc Godard and Anna Karina, who's the star of so many of his movies, French New Wave icons.
So cool.
Film within a film. I love that they were in that.
Yeah, it's really neat how we view it too, because they go to the projection room and then we get to look through the square. Like, it's not like she goes and sits in the audience or anything. Like, it is definitely an unusual way to tell how we're watching, like, film. And and like, thinking of other movies and things that are all like stealing from one another, obviously, like Tarantino, the master of cinematic theft, like absolutely recalls this in Inglourious Bastards. Like, that's literally what we're doing in the projection room is very similar to what we're experiencing here in this film. So to kind of set that standard and say, like, here's how you can do this is pretty cool.
Yeah. And I thought, I didn't really think about it the first time I watched the film, but during this rewatch, I was like, oh, let's analyze things a bit more. The film within the film, I noticed something interesting, and that's because we envision Cleo as a bit of a doll character up until the point that she takes her wig off, right? And watching this silent film, I noticed that Anna Karina, her movements in it are also very doll-like. They're a bit more exaggerated, but they're doll-like. And I feel like maybe Cleo sees a bit of herself in the film. These dolls who don't have control of their own bodies, kind of like her,
Yeah.
But maybe.
I think it's a little bit further removed from like what this film reaches around, but this idea, and I'm just coming off of watching The Bike Riders this afternoon, and this is a very prominent theme in The Bike Riders. It's not a spoiler, so don't worry, but like this idea of like, what does, once society grabs hold of something, what does it become? And that is very prominent for Cleo in this situation of like, should I continue to try to live my life to what society deems that I should, or should I try to grasp that and make that what I want it to be, like my friend, right? And so where does Cleo fall in that line? And is there opportunity to fall somewhere in the middle? Like, can you be both, or can you occupy both spaces? And I think is something that she, in her evolution to like personal understanding, delves into. Like, in the in the final 20 minutes. And when she's alone and in the park and all of these things, she's much less doll-like, right? She is very Cleo, and we learn things about her like that we never knew, even though we thought we knew her, which I think is very interesting.
Absolutely. And then there's also the point to add during this segment as well that's also important. When they leave the theater, she breaks a mirror. Cleo breaks a mirror.
Yep.
And she sees this as a bad omen. Dorothy disagrees, and they pass by a cafe as well, so many cafes, and discover a man was killed there. And so when they enter the taxi, because they left Raoul's car with Raoul, I don't even know why I'm bringing that up, but anyway, Dorothy says that the broken mirror was actually an omen of that man's death, not Cleo's. Yeah. And so it's something interesting to note about this section, because we see Cleo reflected again. This time it's through the broken glass of this reflection of the cafe, right? And I don't know. I don't think that it's accidental to have another instance of Cleo seeing her reflection, particularly at this point in the film, through broken glass. It's almost like she's seeing herself as fragmented, or that her perceptions of herself are now changing. Like she's finally shedding this old image of herself to craft a new one. Yeah,
it's kind of, in my opinion, tethered to like the first act break, like going into the second act when she changes into the black dress. Like that's like, okay, cool. We're doing something new. Cleo is different. And then we see this again going really into what is the final act of the film of like, it is this physical manifestation of evolution and the way that she sees herself physically and through her own eyes, whether that is the clothes she's wearing or not. And I wonder too if it's a little bit of like her that verbal reassurance from her friend of like, that was not an omen for you. Don't worry. That was just an omen for the other guy. If she is able to take that, and maybe that's kind of all she needed all along, was like one person just to say one thing of like, you got this. Like, don't worry. It's all good. And then she feels a little bit better, right? And like that kind of removes her a little bit from that funk, because after that is when she is her most essential self, is when she is really discovering things, albeit with the help of another person, but like that true personal engagement that she really hasn't had up until now.
That's true. But I mean, we could also argue that the fortune teller also told her like, it doesn't have to be death, it's transformation. But I guess she hasn't had the experiences from thus far. She's still so different at this point when she's with her friend than how she was at the film's start. So I think you're right.
It all cycles back to seeing the guy swallow frogs. That's what does it all. Once you see a guy swallow frogs in front of you, you're like, I'm a different person. I'm changed.
Everything is new to me now.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
I see
a
the
baby
world
being born
in a different vision.
Yes. Amazing. So, final portion of the film. Is there anything you want to add before we get to the final encounter?
No, not particularly. I think the notes that I have left are regarding the final 20 minutes of the film.
Okay, good. Let's go. Let's do it. We got this. So Cleo drops Dorothy off and continues in the cab. She notably asks the driver to take her into the park, right?
Yep. Even though he's not technically allowed to do that, which I think is interesting.
And the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because I think that it's almost like she's using this cab as a shield to hide her and give her like a longer sense of anonymity. Right? So she doesn't have to walk through that park. So she enters this park, walks around after getting out of the cab, and she already seems a bit more free, I would say. I think you would probably agree.
I'm literally, I have it up on the other monitor, and I'm literally watching her enter the park, and as she goes down the stairs, it is her dancing with her scarf, saying like, my capricious body, the azure of my audacious eyes, like, she's really been transformed by her friend, which I think again like is really telling of like, cool, like you can just be like happy with what it is. It doesn't all have to be some big life or death situation. Like it could just be joy, and that's okay.
Exactly. And then she's feeling herself. She's having a great time. Then she runs into Antoine, a soldier on leave from the Algerian War. And Antoine starts talking to her, and she's receptive. And this is interesting because she tells him that usually she'd ignore a man approaching her. But today, lo and behold, she's talking. And she even tells him her real name, Florence, which we mentioned earlier. She admits how scared she is by what's going on in her life. And he's sweet to her, and they have this wonderful discussion, and they make an agreement that he'll take her to the hospital to get her test results if she goes with him to the train station. What were your initial thoughts of Antoine?
I think Antoine is a very sweet guy. And I think that he, in some form or fashion, is kind of just a mirror image of Cleo a little bit. Even though he doesn't have maybe the same circumstances, at least that we understand, he has his own damning circumstances. Like, he's going back to the war. Like, he's essentially saying, like, he knows he's probably not going to make it out. And so he has a similar mindset, and I think them finding each other is fascinating because it allows for like this kind of energy to feed off of one another. And he says one thing that I have here. He says about his time not being, kind of on leave, on break. He says, I had 3 weeks. I've done nothing. It's too short. And meanwhile, Cleo, for all she knows, has like whatever, the same amount of time, less time. And so I think for her to hear someone be so transparent, so vulnerable from the start, they don't even know each other. And he's like, I didn't do anything with my vacation. Like, will you walk with me? I think is really interesting to Cleo and like really inviting to her to say like, cool, maybe someone else fills at least a little sliver of what I feel.
Yeah, I think he was really patient and gentle with her. And she finally found someone who would listen and see her for more than just her beauty. Although, I mean, I'm sure he obviously noticed that. But she actually has these intellectual discussions with him for the first time in the film. As you said earlier, we finally start to learn about her. And yeah, we learn about some of her interests, what she knows, what she doesn't know. And so yeah, they go to the hospital. They take the bus instead of a taxi. Also, I love the way they like got on the bus as well. Like,
so
that
cool.
Just doesn't exist anymore.
Honestly, so vicious of the bus operator to throw that old woman off the bus. I don't know if you caught this or saw this, but like Cleo and the guy get on the bus. And then there's this old woman that's trying to hitch a ride behind, and the guy like puts the rope up and he's like, nah, no more. And she's like, all right, I guess I'll just go back to the sidewalk. And I was like, yo, you guys, that's really brutal for that woman. But like, in the circumstances of like how they're making the movie, probably just legit. Probably the guy was probably just like, yo, we're at capacity. Like, I can't do anything for you. And that's about it.
I love that you brought that up.
But I thought it was funny.
No, absolutely. That and the frog guy. So where are we now? So the bus, great time on the bus. And then they arrive at the hospital. The people that work there tell her that the doctor has already left. And I think it's interesting that after initially feeling upset about this entire movie, she's upset. Cleo finally decides that it's not important that she gets the results today. And instead, she wants to enjoy the time that she has left with Antoine. And they finally sit on this bench outside, and lo and behold, the doctor comes by in his car and tells Cleo, rather casually, if I may add, that she has cancer. But he's like, but don't worry, it's not that serious. And after a few months of chemo, you'll be fine. And I mean, you'd think she would lose it here, right? Like anybody would. But suddenly she's like, no, my fear is gone. And she even says that, my fear is gone. And she's happy. Yeah. And Antoine looks more distraught since he says that he hates that he's leaving. He wants to be with her. And she consoles him by telling him that he is with her in this very moment and that they have time. And they stroll away smiling. And it's this beautiful, intimate moment. And that's the end of the film. What are your thoughts about this segment?
Yeah, she says, I think my fear is gone. I think I'm happy. And that is like, that to me, while most of the rest of the film is not as emotionally impactful, at least for me. Yeah. When she says that, I'm like, oh, damn it. Like, we did it. Like, we got to a place of happy tears. Really, really fast. I'm so sorry, but there were two things that I wrote down about the bus ride.
Please.
Just two things that Antoine says that I thought they caught my ear for whatever they might mean to you or anybody else. They bring up the fact that her friend is a nude model, and Antoine says nudity is like summer. It's for everyone, which I just like, I think there's a lot you could break down of that in terms of like male and female perspective and like where like, the world is, where France is at that period of time and like all of these other things. But I also like I think that's great. Like, that's a sick way to look at body positivity. I think that's really, really cool. And then he mentioned something, I think it is during this scene when they're waiting for the doctor, they're walking towards the bench or something like that, talking about travel, and he says, "Doesn't dusk make you want to travel?" And I think that is one of those, just like one of those, not throwaway lines, but one of those like really kind of hidden lines where you're just like, ooh, that's like really good. Because like now every time it turns dusk outside, I'm like, oh, like Cleo and like Antoine, and I want to travel. That's so great. But this scene is so good and so well constructed. And obviously the doctor delivering the news in such a nonchalant fashion is very, in my opinion, like very on purpose. It's very on brand to like what Cleo is going through and discovering, guess what? It's not the end. It's okay. Like there's a plan. It's a beautiful ending. It's a beautiful ending to the movie. Thinking about this movie without having seen it, if you were like, hey, this movie is like 92 minutes long or however it is, 90 minutes long. And we're going to take our main character, Cleo, and we're going to go from very, very scared and petrified of death to an evolution of self-discovery and self-empowerment and happiness and finding joy in the midst of that. I think, just from like an outside perspective, at least for me, I'd be like, well, that's going to feel rushed. Like, how could you do that in 90 minutes? Like, you're going to need 3 hours for that. Like, come on, let's be real with each other. But nothing about this movie feels rushed. Everything feels so remarkably earned in terms of Cleo's evolution and the things she learns and does and how she gets there, especially her relationship with Antoine. Like, it is kind of bursting at the seams with this like really fervent romance, but it's also like two people that just want another person in their life. They just want another soul to talk to. And I think that is truly beautiful about this film.
Yeah. I mean, you couldn't have said it better. I think it's also interesting to note, yes, she goes through this transformation in 90 minutes. Crazy that Varda was able to do that. But on top of that, it's not even that she goes through this transformation in 90 minutes. She goes through this transformation, if you look at it from a real-time perspective, in an hour and a half. She changes her perception of herself and of the world and of everything in an hour and a half, which is crazy to think about. I mean, in an hour and a half, I don't even know what I'm thinking about. Not much. Like, not much changes in an hour and a half. But yeah, it's wonderful. And the whole movie just shows how much Cleo has grown and she's accepted her true self in that hour and a half. But yeah, so much changes. She finally shows interest in the beauties of the world by the end. She tells Antoine her real name, which, I mean, at this point, I don't know how many people know her real name. I think it's also telling that there are no mirrors or any reflections during this final segment, because that shows that she's finally at peace with who she is, or to exist how she is without anybody's other perceptions of her. And something that popped into my mind during this watch that surprised me, this whole journey that Cleo goes on really reminded me of Greta Gerwig's Barbie, where we see this ideal feminine protagonist go on a journey and learn to become a person and embrace everything about themselves, everything that's quote unquote unfeminine. With Cleo, it's the concept of, hey, maybe losing her hair and having to go through this chemotherapy, which also is maybe kind of hinted at when she rips off her wig. But then with Barbie, it's becoming human and not being this perfect doll. But so, yeah, I thought that was a really cool comparison. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just think from a male perspective, she is undoubtedly the most beautiful she has been at the end of the film. Like, it's zero comparison. She's not shopping. She's not wearing like glasses. She's not wearing a wig. Like, she is like, she has found herself, right? And I think that like obviously speaks to that idea of confidence and self-discovery, and how that is a beauty in and of itself. Really like makes this movie so rewatchable. Is that like I could rewatch it tonight and be like, you know, it's all about the inside beauty, and like see it through that lens. And then I could watch it and be like, she is literally physically gorgeous the next time that I watch it. And then I could watch it a different way, like the next time, which I think is so powerful about the film. You mentioned the end being the only time when she's like not around mirrors or anything like that. It's really the only time in the film she's not around crowds of people, which I think is interesting too. And like,
Yes.
kind of, at least it, for me, harkens back to my idea of like, what role does society play on how we view ourselves and how we view beauty standards and how we view potentially life-threatening news. Like, it's all influenced by people around us. So as we have talked about this movie, it has only grown in its ability to be something astounding. I don't think that the first time, the second time, even the third time that you watch this movie, it's that easy to break down like this.
Yeah.
And I think like it possesses so much, and it is wonderful.
Yeah. I agree with you. And especially again in 90 minutes for it to possess this much, that's crazy.
So
I
crazy.
was listening to an interview with Varda where she mentions that at the start of the film, Cleo is defined by obviously the perceptions of those around her, her assistant, even the hat salesman, her boyfriend, the musician, so on. And she looks at herself so much in mirrors, as we were saying. Varda says that Cleo is seen. And she says that the halfway point of the film, 45 minutes in, that's when she starts to crack. And we mentioned all of this already.
Mm-hmm.
And she says that she considers this a feminist approach. She says that she wanted to focus on Cleo as a woman who defines herself through others' visions. And at the same point, because she's the one looking late in the second half of the movie, something changes within her and she redefines herself as her own, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And
yeah, absolutely.
so I find it interesting that she admits that this is a feminist approach. I mean, it is, undoubtedly. But the reason I say this is because Varda didn't often say she made feminist movies. She once said, quote, "I don't want to make feminist cinema either. I just want to tell women's stories about women," end quote. And I mean, I think that this movie is ultimately just a wonderful representation of the female experience. And I think that Varda captures this timelessness that so many women experience at one point in their lives. And yeah, I love her as a filmmaker, the impact she had. Even like, again, the French New Wave movement was basically all men and then Varda. And she just had the gusto to do what she wanted. So she's a legend. That's all I got.
Your kind of tether to Barbie is really interesting in that perspective, because I think Greta is doing something very similar, at least in like modern day Hollywood. And I think it's really interesting you bring that up, because La Bonheur is inherently just a gender flip, like societal story, right? It's just like, it's just about those things. And so like Varda sticks to that and does it really, really well. And yeah, I'm so glad that you had me on to talk about this movie again. It gave me a good excuse to watch it again and to watch another Varda film and really, truly understand the power of good movies after watching Netflix's latest original, Under Paris. So this is great. This is great filmmaking right here.
We love it. Thank you so much for coming on today. Honestly, I had a blast. I think you brought so much to the conversation that, I mean, I didn't even think of. And now I want to go rewatch it again. So I will probably do that. But did you want to shout out your socials or podcast or YouTube or anything or all?
Yeah, sure. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, or Letterboxd at Ethan Simmie. It's just my first and last name. And then check out the pods. 24 minutes of A24. We just talk about the latest and greatest A24 stuff. Obviously, we got Maxine coming out. We got Sing Sing coming out. A lot of good A24 stuff that we're going to be covering. We've got the Movie Draft podcast. So if you're looking for a little bit of a less analytical view of films and a more gamified version of like, hey, this movie's cool and it's just about dudes who rock, then come check out the Movie Draft podcast. We're every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcast. Myself, Sophie Holsinger, a very prominent member of the film community and the Letterboxd Society out there, and Ben Lawhorn. We do all sorts of fun movie drafts on that show. And then, like you mentioned, my YouTube channel, Movies Are So Back. You can check me out there. It's still in its infancy. It's still growing, but yeah, all kinds of movie reviews, trailer reactions, some ranking videos coming up, all sorts of cool movie stuff.
You're a busy guy, and I absorb it all. Guy. So I love it so much. But yeah, I had a blast today. Hope you did too. And yeah, I hope to have you back.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marta. I appreciate it.
Cool. See you, Ethan.
Thanks. Bye.